Welcome back to the deep dive. If you've ever felt like philosophy is this dense forest you can't really navigate without an expert guide, you've definitely come to the right place. Today, we're not just exploring a forest. We're going deeper. We're looking at the entire architectural blueprint of the mind, courtesy of Immanuel Kant.
And that blueprint, for most people, it starts and stops with the critique of pure reason and maybe the critique of practical reason, the heavy hitters.
Right.
But today, we are pushing past that foundational stuff to focus on the essential underlying drive, the unstated system that required the third and I think often most misunderstood work, the critique of judgment.
Our mission today is, well, it's pretty ambitious. We want to understand the profound personal conviction that Kant held, this teleological conviction that was just too deep, too dear to him to ever explicitly call into question.
Exactly. And this conviction is what dictates the shape of his entire critical philosophy. It's what sets the ultimate philosophical battlefield for his successors, particularly, Hegel.
So it's a detective story, really. We're looking for the engine behind the machine.
It really is. And the best place to start is with Kant's own assessment of what philosophy even is. He left us with this powerful, almost humbling statement. He said, "Philosophy, unless it be in an historical manner, cannot be learned. We can at most learn to philosophize."
That is a fundamental distinction, isn't it? It immediately tells you that you can't just, absorb knowledge and suddenly become a philosophical pioneer. Knowing what Plato or Locke thought, that's history. Doing philosophy is something else entirely.
Precisely. Our source material calls this a minimum truth. It suggests that genuine philosophical progress, deducing new methods, identifying new problems, fundamentally shifting a worldview, it doesn't come from following a logical recipe book. It springs from the individual's complete personality, the holistic union of their intellectual and moral faculties, and their essential reaction against the existing state of thought.
So when we, as students or just curious learners, approach Kant, our duty isn't just to absorb his complex categories or maxims.
No, not at all.
We have to identify his fundamental standpoint, and then critically we have to prepare our own reaction to it. If you're not reacting, you're not philosophizing.
It's a call to arms for critical thinking.
Wow.
But here's the rub, and this is why our quest today is so challenging. Philosophers are notoriously bad about showing their hand. They rarely explicitly state the ideas operating at the back of their minds. Those core convictions, the sources that drive the criticism, they're generally not the objects of the criticism.
They lay out the finished, polished, logical system, but they hide the deeply personal, intuitive moment that birthed it. It's like being shown a beautiful cathedral, but never, ever seeing the foundation stones.
Now, Kant, to his credit, he's more detailed than most. He meticulously outlines his search for synthetic a priori presuppositions, the necessary conditions for knowledge, morality, and eventually aesthetics. He tells us how he built the system.
He does. But even with all that detail, our core quest today remains. We're looking beyond the explicit instruction to find that one profound conviction, the one that was just too dear to him to ever subject to scrutiny. What was the central presupposition underlying all his criticism that always left him satisfied? That's what we need to nail down. Okay, so let's unpack this central unstated engine. It has everything to do with how Kant constructed the validity of knowledge in the first place, right? Back in the Critique of Pure Reason.
Absolutely. He spent enormous effort proving that concepts like causality and substance, the categories, were necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. That was the positive case.
And that was his huge victory over Humean skepticism.
A massive victory. The categories justified the understanding's function, which was making the raw materialist sensation, the manifold, into something coherent, into something that the mind could actually operate on. It made the world something for it.
But the sources make it really clear that Kant's ultimate test for the validity of any faculty was twofold. It wasn't just about what the faculty could do. It was this dual concept, function plus restriction.
And this restriction is the absolute key to unlocking the whole system. Kant had to establish the positive function of the understanding, while at the same time ensuring that this function didn't step on the toes of any other essential capacity of the mind.
Okay.
So the understanding's function was proven, but its application was strictly restricted to the world of phenomena, things as they appear to us in space and time.
Why was that restriction so critical? And it sounds almost arbitrary. Why build this magnificent philosophical engine only to immediately slap a giant speed limit sign on it?
Because by imposing that limit, by restricting knowledge to the phenomenal world, he simultaneously achieved his negative goal. which was saving the noumena, the things in themselves, from the grasp of scientific determinism. This allowed scope for the other great human faculty, the practical moral faculty. So the world of noumena, the world we can never truly know empirically, that's saved as a potential sphere for our freedom. If the entire world were just scientifically determined, then morality, choice, responsibility, they'd all be illusions.
Exactly. The practical faculty, our moral will, our freedom, was established as completely sui generis unique in a class of its own and entirely distinct from the process of acquiring knowledge.
So knowledge was for nature, morality was for freedom.
Right, this dual separation where each faculty was sovereign in its own restricted sphere, this was what inherently satisfied Kant.
And if we look at that dual framework, what is the ultimate conclusion about the nature of the mind itself? What was he getting at?
It reveals his deep-seated, unstated conviction. The mind is structured as a system with various special faculties, all combining harmoniously in a teleological unity.
A teleological unity.
Yes,
Yeah.
that harmony, that conviction that the parts of the mind were designed to work together without mutual destruction, that is the foundation Kant never, ever questioned.
It's the philosophical equivalent of saying, even though the physics engine and the ethics engine run on different fuels, they have to be housed in the same functional structure.
And we don't have to merely infer this teleological viewpoint. The sources explicitly reference Kant's own remark where he uses a biological analogy. He says, reason is, in regard to the principles of cognition, a perfectly distinct, independent unity in which, as in an organized body, every member exists for the sake of the others and all for the sake of each.
That's fascinating. He's describing the mind as a living organism. And a teleological viewpoint, the perspective that things are organized toward a purpose or an end, is, by his own definition, the specific concern of the faculty of judgment.
Right. So long before he explicitly wrote the Critique of Judgment, the necessary standpoint from which he conducted all his criticism, the implicit conviction that the mind must be a unified system, was the standpoint of judgment. And this is why the entire critical project, despite its incredible complexity, starts from what our source material calls a comparatively humble position. It's focused on ensuring coherence, which is a world away from the sweeping claims of someone like Hegel later on.
So Kant begins with this radical distinction. You've got the theoretical faculty, the understanding, which legislates for nature, and then the practical faculty, reason, which legislates for freedom. Yet he secretly insists on this overarching teleological unity, which, I mean, this begs the core logical problem, right?
It does.
If the two spheres, nature and freedom, are perfectly distinct and only negatively related, how can we recognize their essential harmony a priori?
That's the gap the third critique has to fill. A negative relationship, just not contradicting each other, that isn't enough to prove they're a unified system designed for a purpose.
Right.
But Kant, through reflection, realized the distinction was not ultimate, because the two worlds mutually presuppose each other.
Okay, let's break that down, that mutual presupposition. Starting with nature. How does the world of nature, the domain of deterministic science, how does that actually presuppose our moral freedom?
Well, the whole project of the Critique of Pure Reason hinges on it. If the categories of understanding applied to reality, absolutely. If nature were the only reality, then everything, including our actions, would be deterministic.
Everything's just cause and effect.
Right. The theoretical critique only escapes a massive self-contradiction if nature is understood as a phenomenal world. By showing the limits of empirical knowledge, the theoretical ideas of reason are given this regulative function, pointing toward a supersensible reality where the concept of freedom can actually operate.
So if nature wasn't just phenomenal, freedom would be intellectually impossible.
You couldn't even think it. So the limits of science create the possibility of morality.
Okay, now for the reverse. How does freedom presuppose nature?
Freedom, our practical will, it can't exist in a vacuum. It has to be a will that wills something. If there were no world in which our moral choices could be realized or manifested, the moral law would be meaningless. It would be a complete non-starter. The Critique of Practical Reason showed that nature must be used as the type of the moral law. Freedom needs a reliable, ordered, phenomenal nature in which it can act and, affect its goals.
This sounds like the ultimate justification for the entire system rests on the subjective, living subject, the I.
It does. Think back to the categories of understanding. They are only justified as conditions of an experience that is mine. The skeptic who doubts the whole process can only be silenced by the realization that I am the ultimate foundation of validity. The subjective I, as a subject that wills to have experience, is the final anchoring point for all three critiques.
So the mind isn't just three separate silos. It's an interconnected ecosystem driven by the subject's fundamental will to know and to act morally.
And that profound recognition led to the unavoidable question. If this systematic connection is so essential, must there not be a capacity of the mind whose entire purpose is to exist because of this harmonious connection between the theoretical and practical faculties? A capacity that is constitutive a priori, precisely by reconciling these ultimate differences.
So the third critique isn't some neat little add-on. It's the necessary capstone that justifies the foundational conviction that Kant started with. The conviction that the mind is a unified teleological system. Without it, the whole structure might just look internally inconsistent.
So having established the theoretical need for this, we have to look at the specific catalyst. The sources make a really critical distinction here. The discovery of the third critical faculty, it wasn't driven by some abstract logical lacuna. Kant didn't just realize he had two fingers and needed a third.
It was prompted by concrete intellectual problems demanding attention. The sources say the converging results of different lines of thought arising from the consideration of different concrete problems views those of aesthetics and of organic life.
Right. He needed a solution that was already ready at hand within the structure of the mind.
And this search led him to the missing piece of the human mind. The first critique dealt with cognition, the understanding. The second dealt with desire-reason, the will.
But there's a third fundamental faculty that sits right between them, the feeling of pleasure and displeasure.
The faculty that gives, as you said earlier, warmth and color to the world. If we can't find an intellectual underpinning for this, then aesthetics and biology subjects Kant deeply cared about, they're just reduced to mere animal sensation, divorced from any rational significance.
Exactly. The question became, can this feeling be governed by an intellectual presupposition, or does it fall outside the scope of rational transcendental philosophy? So let's just compare the established roles. Understanding was constitutive a priori for science. Reason was constitutive a priori for morals. Where does judgment stand?
It seems intermediate, just as the feeling of pleasure stands between cognition, cold knowledge, and desire, this hot pursuit. But judgment itself needs to be broken down into two very different modes of operation.
And that's the core distinction in this section, determinate versus reflective judgment. Determinate judgment is the simple application of law. The universal, the rule, the category is given, and the mind simply subsumes the particular observation under it. This function was covered entirely by the critique of pure reason, its routine classification.
And reflective judgment is the opposite. The specific observation, the weird new phenomenon is given, and the mind has to actively search for the appropriate universal or rule to explain it.
And because it searches, it needs a special guiding principle, a kind of underlying attitude or even a prejudice to determine its line of thought. This prejudice isn't a law of nature, like causality, but it's a subjective maxim that tells the mind. Keep looking, there must be a pattern here. And we have to know if this intellectual prejudice can be justified a priori.
Let's ground this in science, because that's the first problem Kant tackled with reflective judgment. The critique of pure reason already justified the most general laws, like Newton's physics, cause and effect. But those general laws didn't guarantee that the specific empirical laws, the endless diversity of nature, would form a coherent system.
This is the magnitude of the scientific task. Imagine you're a 19th century chemist. General physics tells you that matter behaves predictably, but it doesn't guarantee that the thousands of specific chemical reactions or the laws governing unique biological species will be amenable to your categorization system.
Right.
Nature could present itself as irreducible heterogeneity, a complete disorganized mess.
And if that were true, science beyond general physics would be impossible. You'd need some kind of faith that nature is manageable.
And that's where reflective judgment steps in. It is entitled to assume, as a guiding principle, that nature, in its multiplicity of particular laws, is ordered according to a plan adapted to our faculties of cognition. This is the principle of the finality of nature in its multiplicity.
I want to pause on that term, finality. It implies purpose. But Kant is explicitly avoiding attributing objective purpose to nature, right?
Absolutely crucial. It is a subjective principle, a maxim of judgment. It is not a concept of nature, like causality, or a concept of freedom, like duty. It attributes nothing objective to the physical object. It simply describes the attitude we must adopt if we are to successfully build a systematic body of science that unites disparate empirical laws.
And the reward for successfully applying this maxim, pleasure.
Yes, but specifically a pleasure of relief or attainment. When the scientist or the natural historian finally finds the systematic unity in the messy data, when they find a comprehensive classification system, they're rejoiced because they have attained their aim. It's the pleasure of successfully navigating the chaos of being relieved of a want.
So even in the dry business of creating scientific classifications, the mind is driven by a subjective a priori principle, the search for finality, which, when successful, validates itself through a feeling of rational pleasure. That's how Kant connects cold cognition to the feeling of pleasure, completing the cognitive part of the systematic unity. So we've established the pleasure of attainment in the scientific sphere. Now we move to the purer, more immediate pleasure, the one most people associate with the third critique, the aesthetic judgment of beauty.
Right. The definition of finality is still central. The end of an object is the concept that contains the ground of its actuality. The finality of form is the agreement of a thing with a constitution, only possible according to ends.
Okay.
So in science, we were happy because we found the agreement, the system. In aesthetics, we feel pleasure merely by apprehending the form.
So Kant was looking for a pleasure that was immediately bound up with the apprehension of the object's form, without any concern for what the object is or what it does. It's just pure form.
This gives us the aesthetic representation of finality. This immediate pleasure arises not from the objective qualities of the thing, but from the mere subjective side of apprehension. It's about the unique way the object stimulates the mind's cognitive machinery.
And how is that machinery stimulated? What constitutes beauty, transcendentally speaking?
Beauty is the perception of an object that stimulates our two primary cognitive faculties: the imagination, for receiving the data and the understanding, for synthesizing the data to lively and harmonious activity. They are, you could say, dancing together, effortlessly.
That makes profound sense. I mean, if the imagination and understanding are in sync, that harmonious feeling must be the basis for any successful cognitive process.
Precisely. Since harmonious activity is a general prerequisite for knowledge itself, nature must afford a field for this immediate aesthetic judgment if it is to be known at all. The beauty of nature is simply this aesthetic representation of finality, observed by attending to the mere form of the representation, isolated from all other concerns.
So, when I look at a beautiful landscape and feel pleasure, Kant argues that this feeling is not arbitrary. It's the transcendental confirmation that my cognitive faculties are working in harmony, that they're ready to receive and process knowledge. It's a rational pleasure, moving beyond mere animal sensation.
It's highly intellectualized pleasure. And this explains why Kant's aesthetics is so intensely abstract. He wasn't trying to instruct artists or critique specific works of art. The sources emphasize his inquiry was not undertaken with a view to the formation or culture of taste, but was merely directed to its transcendental aspects.
He was interested in the structure of the mind that makes the experience of beauty possible, not the historical outcome of that structure in, say, a particular artistic movement.
Right. The true philosophical purpose of the Critique of Judgment was not art criticism. It was to find a distinctive intellectual presupposition that governs the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, thereby completing the systemic bridge. It shows that the theoretical understanding and the practical reason share a common root in the systematic harmony of the judging subject. That act of unifying the theoretical and practical realms while maintaining their legislative sovereignty is the true achievement of the third critique. Now we arrive at the great confrontation, because the Critique of Judgment demonstrates this necessary systematic connection, this unity of nature and freedom. It has often been misunderstood by critics who stress the unity indicated rather than the critical restrictions imposed by Kant.
They see the bridge and immediately forget the foundations the bridge rests on. They just label the CJ as the smooth transition from Kant to Hegel,
which fundamentally misrepresents Kant's philosophical temperament and aspiration and the vast, vast gulf that separates the two systems. We have to contrast their ultimate positions.
Okay, let's start with Kant's stance. We've established it as comparatively humble. Critical philosophy points toward an ideal, a unity, that it never fully attains.
Except through the practical demands of morality.
Right. It's a system that critically examines the presuppositions of science, art, and morals, while strictly keeping them in distinct sovereign compartments.
The whole system is structured by limits. The philosopher is a careful architect of boundaries. Hegel's stance, however, is maximally exalted. Hegelian philosophy aims for the absolute, the peak of thought. The absolute idea, the absolute Wissen. This is the final, concrete reconciliation, the point where all distinctions are overcome and the dialectic process just ceases. It stops because thought has finally comprehended itself and the world completely.
So if Hegel is right, then the gaps Kant insisted on, the unknowable noumena, the unattained systematic unity, they aren't gaps at all. They're just stages in thought that are eventually overcome by the absolute idea.
Precisely. And this is where the Kantian critique of Hegel becomes, well, devastating. If the absolute idea is truly absolute, its proof must be ironclad. But a Kantian observer would argue that the proof that the absolute idea is the final form of pure thought must always remain negative.
Explain that, the negativity of proof.
The only way Hegel proves the absolute idea is final is by demonstrating that all preceding categories in the logic contain an inadequacy, a contradiction, that forces thought forward. When you reach the absolute idea, the proof is simply our current inability to find inadequacy in it. We are stumped. We can't find the next logical step.
And the Kantian immediately asks, what if the next logical step simply hasn't been found yet? What if the inadequacy is just beyond our current cognitive limits?
Exactly. The Kantian framework suggests the absolute idea might only be a horizon of pure thought. It's a limit that constantly retreats as philosophy and knowledge advance. To claim finality in the present moment is dangerous. The absolute idea may be absolute in name and on paper, but inadequate for us, except maybe as an unattainable practical ideal, which forces us right back into Kant's humility.
It sounds like Kant is taking Hegel's ultimate truth and essentially turning it into a goalpost that just keeps moving further away, denying philosophy its grand conclusion.
That is the core conflict. And there is also the critical issue of content. Critics argue that Hegel fails to indicate a concrete, knowable state where the absolute idea is actually exemplified. He claims the unity, but does he truly show the content where all inadequacy is finally transcended?
The sources suggest Hegel has a powerful counterpoint to that content difficulty.
He does. Hegel argues that the absolute idea's true content is the whole system of the logic that precedes it. It's not an empty box. It is the final self-illumination of the entire dialectical journey. Its strength is the comprehensive necessity of the system itself.
And conversely, Hegel throws this back at Kant's supersensible unity, the bridge in the third critique.
Yes. Hegel argues that Kant's supersensible world, which performs the reconciliation between nature and freedom, turns its back on all that has gone before. Kant has to postulate an unknowable content, the nominal realm, to perform the reconciliation. And this unknowable content is arbitrary because it's outside the scope of knowledge. Hegel, by contrast, relies on the necessary development of thought, where every stage is comprehended.
So the debate boils down to, is ultimate unity comprehensible through reason, which is Hegel, or must it be assumed, but ultimately remain unknowable to theoretical reason, which is Kant? That is the philosophical crossroads. Let's step away from the purely theoretical claims for a second and look at the practical utility and the cultural impact of both systems. This is where the sources offer a really fascinating perspective on Kant's difficulty.
It's a common complaint, right? That Kant's philosophy is almost impenetrable. It's notoriously difficult to understand, and the sources say, quite frankly, Kant, misunderstood, is repellent. It's dry, it's abstract, and it's meticulous.
But paradoxically, this abstraction, this inherent difficulty, is his saving grace.
It really is. A partial understanding of Kant does not generally lead to an attitude contrary to his original intention. Because the system is so abstract, it can endure vast shifts in scientific knowledge. It presents a world picture accurate in all essentials, a framework that is robust. It performs necessary police duties against philosophers or scientists who overreach the limits of human reason.
So, his system is inherently resistant to dangerous simplification, whereas Hegel, who is arguably just as difficult, is prone to strongly attractive and potentially harmful misinterpretation among the masses.
This is the risk of the dialectic becoming popular. When the Hegelian triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is simplified, when it becomes the platitude that there are two sides to every question, you encounter a massive philosophical collapse. The source jokes that there are two sides to a railway station, but that observation doesn't get you anywhere philosophically.
The danger, then, is the effacing of all relative values. If you reduce profound historical conflict or moral necessity down to just a simple step in an inevitable dialectical process towards synthesis, you lose the ability to judge essential values as truly essential. Everything is just a necessary phase.
Exactly. The true Hegelian who understands the profound necessary development within the logic would argue that Hegel should remain unpopular among the general public to safeguard the system's integrity. Kant's abstraction acts as a filter. Hegel's systematic comprehensiveness acts as a magnet for oversimplification.
Beyond popularity, there's the issue of scientific obsolescence. Hegel tried to make his system concrete, and the sources point directly to his philosophy of nature.
Oh, that work? The philosophy of nature is described as being in process of becoming obsolete while being written. It was bound to the specific, evolving state of science in the early 19th century. It requires a continuous succession of Hegels to keep it current. It's tentative and merely illustrative of his underlying logical structure.
And that contrasts so powerfully with Kant. By focusing on abstract, a priori conditions of experience and morality, Kant conceived of an abstract metaphysics of nature and morals that could be elaborated and definitely completed for all time.
Kant created the durable intellectual structure, the individual scientific discoveries, the empirical laws, they change. But the framework for understanding how we know them remains fixed. This is why Kant remains invaluable, even to the most ardent Hegelian.
How so? If Hegel believes he has the absolutely true philosophy, the world itself thoroughly recognized as concrete mind, why would he need Kant's restrictive system?
Because the absolutely true philosophy is almost always out of reach. Life is messy. Knowledge is incomplete. Kant's critical philosophy provides an essential substitute or a critical unification from a teleological standpoint. It forbids senseless declamation about the absolute idea until the content and process are fully comprehended. Kant forces us back to the groundwork. He provides the necessary intellectual police duties until the Hegelian can fully justify their comprehensive system.
As we conclude this deep dive, let's circle back to Kant's own definition of philosophy, because it provides the final perspective on why his restrictive system is so ultimately profound. He defines philosophy as a system of all philosophical cognition, but he divides the concept into two ways we can view it.
Right. The first is the scholastic conception. This focuses purely on logical completeness, is the academic pursuit, the system of cognition we try to elaborate into a perfect internally consistent science. It's the philosophy of the artist who occupies himself with conceptions.
And the second, the truly fundamental one, is the cosmical conception, conceptus cosmicus. What does this concept entail?
This is the science of the relation of all cognition to the ultimate and essential aims of human reason, the teleologia rationis humanae. It's not just about logical consistency, it's about purpose and ultimate human destiny. In this conception, the philosopher is no longer just an artist working with ideas, but a lawgiver.
A lawgiver in what sense?
As a lawgiver, the philosopher establishes the principles that govern how we conduct our intellectual and moral lives, ensuring that we never confuse the limits of science with the scope of morality, and vice versa. This objective philosophy is the idea of a possible science, the perfect prototype, the standard by which all subjective human philosophies are judged. We can only approximate this ideal.
Which brings us right back to the very beginning. Kant says explicitly that until we find the right path to this objective philosophy, we cannot learn philosophy. It does not exist.
Which leaves us with the only viable path, learning to philosophize. We must constantly exercise our powers of reasoning, guided by established principles, but always retaining the right, the critical duty, to investigate, test, and even reject those principles.
Kant's entire critical project is thus a massive, systematic instruction manual on how to philosophize responsibly. It insists on its own limits while pointing directly toward a necessary systematic unity based on the harmonious structure of the mind's three faculties.
And that leaves us with the ultimate provocative thought, something for you to mull over. If the goal of philosophical inquiry is the absolute idea, the world recognized as concrete mind, and if, as Kant's critique suggests, the pursuit of that ultimate unity constantly retreats before the advances of knowledge, forcing us to constantly admit inadequacy.
Does that mean Kant's more humble, restrictive approach, the one that simply secures the necessary scope for science and morality by building a durable, abstract framework, is the only eternally sustainable intellectual project for us, the finite human beings who are always only learning to philosophize?
The challenge remains to be a lawgiver or to chase the absolute. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Kant's unstated system.
We'll see you next time.